Okay. I want to welcome everybody and say hello first and foremost. I am Mr. Joshua Cotton coming at you from the Department of History and Philosophy as a representative for the Institute for Social Justice and Race Relations. And we want to thank you for coming out for our fourth day of Juneteenth activities. Today we have the celebrated author of The Sacred Place, They Tell Me of Home, 12 Gates to the City, Listen to the Lambs, The Coming, Perfect Peace, and Don't Cry for Me. Full professor at Clark University, Dr. Daniel Omotosho Black. Dr. Black, thank you for coming today, sir.
Glad to be here, my brother, and I appreciate all of y'all for having me.
Oh, we love having, our great special guests who come in every single time. Y'all do amazing.
Yes, yes, sir.
So today we are going to discuss a couple of your works. We'll also be
Yes.
discussing your method and how all of this ties in with Juneteenth. So
Awesome,
are you
awesome.
good with that?
I'm fantastic with that. Absolutely.
Okay. Just so our audience know, we'll start off with a couple of questions. After that, then we'll walk into a audience Q&A. That should be
Okay.
about the last 15 minutes. If you have some questions during it, you can type us directly in the chat. They'll let us know. But for the most part, try and hold them to the end. You will be able to talk with Dr. Black, so don't worry about that. So to begin, I did my due diligence sitting down with you today. Well, about as much due diligence as I can give, given the amount of time that we all have.
Right.
Your books cover the gambit from sexuality, religion, gender identity, abuse, racial pride, self-love to family. I mean, you covered the full spectrum of what it means to be human in your works. As a writer, how do you plot what subjects you're going to address in your works?
Well, ironically, Professor, I don't ever plot it. I don't ever decide. The topics come to me. It's something very spiritual, something very surreal. Like I can simply be walking down the street and I'll see a person and the narrative begins to form around them, right? Or I can read something in the newspaper, I can see something on the news, and something will trigger, and a story will come. And it's the strangest thing, but that's the way it happens. In fact, I have tried to in a very kind of formulaic way conceive a story and write it, and it never works. It absolutely never works. I can't get it off the ground. It doesn't go anywhere. But that's because I've conceived it as opposed to spirit conceiving it and giving it to me.
So it's
So
being transmitted to you, you feel like.
absolutely, it's being channeled to me. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, in your works, are there any taboos that you feel are beyond or out of the bounds for a writer?
No. In fact, for me, unless and until a writer is at the place where she or he can tell it all, can bear themselves completely, can stand, metaphorically speaking, naked before the world, they're not ready to write. See, the whole point of writing is to say what the rest of us won't say, right? The whole point of writing is to really is to force the world into conversations that most of us are absolutely willing to step over, to ignore, not to have. And the other thing about writing that I think is so profound is that writing is supposed to make us free whether we want to be free or not. There are people who choose bondage as safety, but writing disallows that. And unless and until a person is able to say, here's the truth, here's what I know to be the truth, and let's talk about it. If we're afraid of the truth, a person cannot write.
Okay. Well, you mentioned bondage is safety. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes. I think most people in the world, quite frankly, agree to certain levels of self-imposed incarceration. Most people avoid vulnerabilities. Most people decide there are certain things I can never say. And if I'm gonna be just really honest about it here, right? I think black people in general do this. We're the masters of silence. We come from grandmothers and grandfathers who spent a lifetime knowing things, but they never told us. Right? Some of that was saving themselves heartache. Some of that was them thinking they were saving and sparing us. But the truth of the matter is that we come from people who lived pockets of silence, who live a kind of self-constructed bondage. And sometimes also that bondage is it's because we have pains and we have difficulties and we have traumas too heavy to bear. And so we decide that, you know what, I'm not gonna deal with that. I can't handle that right now. That's too much for me today. And so we literally just simply step over it. We step beyond it. There are things we act like we don't see and we're staring directly at it. because sometimes a lie is easier to carry than the truth.
That's very profound. I like that last bit. Lie is easier to carry than the truth. It kind of goes to the entire discussion that we've had previously about things like CRT, where people would rather keep and maintain this lie about civilization and about themselves rather than face up to the truth.
Oh,
So, I
certainly.
mean, as a society, where do we go with that? How do we balance between people's need to keep themselves that bondage of safety, that need to keep their illusions, and our need to push these bounds for social justice?
That's right. And the truth of the matter, we're not going to have any social justice professor without pushing these boundaries of truth. But part of the problem is that we're living in a society where we're being taught directly and indirectly that that each of us is an independent entity. See, that's what ruins the call for truth, because the call for truth sits in the middle of a thing called community, right? And community is the safety that we would believe we have, the assumed safety of human beings next to each other. And the real truth, y'all, is our job is to protect each other. Our job is to love each other. Our job is to honor each other. Our job is to be there for each other. But when we fail to do that, we as human beings, we panic as individuals, and we think we need to protect ourselves. We think we need to build up walls around us because nobody else is going to help me but me. And those walls keep us from really sharing and knowing our truth with each other, because most of us exist as very fragile individuals because we just don't believe other people are going to love us and fight for us the way we need it. And so we end up having to do it ourselves. And what that generally means is most of us are very suspicious and most of us are very cautious in the world because we feel that we're at the edge, in terms of knowing and believing that other people have our backs. And when you live that kind of life, truth is hard to come by, truth is hard to share, because the last thing you want to do is to stand exposed and vulnerable in a world that you think is full of people who would not protect you if they had the chance.
Wow. Yeah, that fear and vulnerability just becomes kind of a central point in many of our identities.
Absolutely.
Um, well, just to move on a little bit, many of your books cover a range of historical topics, from the transatlantic slave trade to Emmett Till,
Yes.
all the way to
Yes.
your own personal family history.
Yes.
What do you feel is the significance of historical connection for Black people?
I think history for Black people in America, Professor Cotton, I think history for Black people in America is the blood of our existence. Unless we really know our history as Black people in America, unless we really connect with our history, unless we're very intentional about knowing that history and incorporating it into our lives, our time on this planet is limited. Because, see, what history will do is tell you how to proceed into the future. History will tell you what you need to do tomorrow that didn't work yesterday. History tells you who, in fact, gave their lives for you and under what circumstances and why. And that's important because each generation has to save the next. But you have to know how to do it. And you have to know under what circumstances. Like those in the 50s and 60s marched in the streets to save us. We needed it. They loved us. They sacrificed their lives to do it. We are not really marching in the streets these days, but there is something we must do in order to save the next generation that I think is absolutely positively critical. And unless we do it, the next generation will be doomed. And for me, that is, we have to assume ourselves the elders of the children. Don't wait for the children to invite us. We must do it ourselves, and we must cover them. This is how you get a whole thing called hip hop music that degrades and literally denigrates Black people, though white folks are paying us millions of dollars to do it. See, the only reason that's possible is because elders were not intervening to say to a 16, to say to an 18-year-old young man, don't ever sell your dignities, young man. Don't ever sell your character. See, without that, young folks literally sold our birthright unto a nation that was willing to pay us millions to call ourselves bitches and hoes and tricks, etc. That's not even intelligent as a people. But if there were no elders to teach that principle, this is what happens. Right? So that was a long way of saying that history is critical. And what history has showed us is that young people without elders will do and say anything.
So our youth are directed by our actions today, and that our actions and how we view ourselves in society is what ends up shifting and shaping the future.
Oh, absolutely. In no uncertain terms. Absolutely.
Well, you brought up hip hop and you brought up some of the negative aspects of it. Do you just have negative views of hip hop, or?
No, no, no. I think hip hop, I mean, there's some brilliant, brilliant, brilliant hip hop. In fact, the artistic genius in hip hop is absolutely unmatched. I mean, young people can make words rhyme that shouldn't rhyme at all. It's just the most genius art form I've ever seen. The problem is that it's untempered. It's untempered, right? And anything untempered will have raggedy edges. But as a genre of music and as an art form, it's sheer brilliance.
Well, you mentioned untempered, but can't we also see untempered as free? If you're talking about expression and free expression in literature, how does that differ from free expression or free expression in, say, hip hop?
See, freedom and a lack of temper are not the same things to me, because freedom also has boundaries. Freedom has limitations. Freedom is not do whatever the hell you want to, whenever you want to, however you want to do it. That's not freedom. In fact, that's a lack of discipline. That's a lack of sight, right? Freedom is knowing how to move through a thing, knowing how to discover the rhythm of a moment, knowing how to honor that rhythm, and knowing how to move in harmony with it, right? That's freedom for me, right? Tempering, right? Tempering is the wisdom to understand how to use a historical moment, or the wisdom to understand how to apply character unto an art form. And without that, we'll get things that actually backfire and that cost us integrity as a people while we're calling it creative art.
And from your experience, where does that wisdom come from?
I think that wisdom comes from elders. I think that wisdom absolutely comes from elders. And, most of us, well, you all are younger than I am, but, I come from a generation where I grew up with grandmother next door. I grew up with my grandfather down the road. I had elders around me all the time, and they were constantly spewing wisdom. They were constantly speaking proverbs into my life. They were constantly telling me things to make me think and rethink moments, which now, it's completely and absolutely priceless. It's left me with a consciousness. It's left me with a sensibility that makes me guard, makes me check, makes me think, makes me rethink everything I do. Right. And it generally makes me proud of what I come out with.
Well, I hate to date myself. I'm 36 here, but I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I come from the backwoods, essentially, down on the coast of Mississippi,
Yeah.
down in a place called DeLille. They're famous
yes.
by Jesmond Ward.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We're famous for, we'll do a drive-by on a horse and a golf cart. I mean, it's crazy. They sell drugs, and they also they raise, hogs in the back.
Yes.
But
yes.
in those smaller, older communities, you generally see that those senses of community and that responsibility to each other within there are still upheld, rather than, say, the systems that you'll see in more urban areas where it's more about self-independence or self-reliance.
That's right. As a child, I remember, I grew up on a farm too. And my father, we'd plant 4 and 5 acres. There were only 6 of us in the house. There's no way we would eat all that food. But I remember Dad always said, you always plant more than you can eat, because someone else will be hungry too. Right? That seems so simple. But not only is it not simple, it's profound and it's salvific, because Daddy was planting to feed the whole community. But see, what I didn't understand as a child is he was doing that because we needed them for something else. Yes, we might have some okra to share. We might have some collard greens to share. We might have some corn to share, right? But when I needed someone to help me with algebra, Daddy was no good. I'd have to go down the street, and get Mr. So-and-so, who was a school teacher. But we gave him greens last week. You see, so So it's this reciprocity that's going on continuously, right? That makes a community work and makes a community magical, I think.
Well, how do you feel that community translates in, say, Black academia? I'm trying to throw you kind of softball lob there, because I mean that's one of the things that we all focus on is
Absolutely.
that working together and that interdisciplinary views and functions.
Well, I'm gonna, I'm gonna run with your question, and I'm gonna risk answering it honestly. Part of the problem for me in academia is that too many people believe that degrees give them worth, right? And that the worth of their being is actually in the acquisition, right, of degrees. That's different from the utility of knowledge, right? And I want us to use knowledge. I work at a Black college, of course, Clark Atlanta University, and I love where I work. I love the minds I get to inspire, and the way they get to inspire me. It's just absolutely fantastic. This is my 30th year on faculty at Clark, and if I could go back, I'd do it again, all over again. I really, truly, truly, truly would. The one thing, though, that I think is important is I would push us as an institution to stop using white people and stop using white models of education and white models of intellectual practices as the way we as Black folks should do our institutional building. Right? I think there are too many ways that we have used white folks as the model of things and just kind of dipped it in Black, right? And try to make it work at Black institutions. And I think there are some things that simply do not work well for us that might work for white folks, and that's fine. But I don't think it necessarily works well for us. But we keep trying to use that because we have been taught, right, that if a thing is white, it's right, and that's not true at all.
I'll say this. There are some differences in between, say, a private institution versus a public institution. And there's oversight with these public institutions that we don't necessarily all get to control. But I am 100% with you, and I'm pretty sure everyone else in this chat is along the same lines in that sense of self-determination within Black education.
Absolutely.
All right, now let's move on to one of your earlier works. Well, not necessarily that early. Let's move on to one of your works, The Coming. I found this book extremely interesting. Not only are you telling the story of the transatlantic slave trade and the spirit of the people, but the structure that you use in this book, it's unique. The book is almost like you're doing a collective stream of consciousness, where you're talking about all of these different people who are merged together in an instinctual, as an instinct of the narrator. We don't have a single narrator, we have a single voice, but that single voice speaks for the multitudes. What inspired you to do that?
When I was in graduate school, I read a slave narrative, the narrative of Olaudah Equiano, who spoke about having been on the Middle Passage. And I became absolutely, positively fascinated with the Middle Passage, both as a historical moment and as the kind of the defining moment of the transformation of Africans into African diasporic individuals, right? And so I began to study this Middle Passage, this middle moment, if you will, of the transplantation of African people worldwide. And it has always, always fascinated me because not only is it horrific, right? It's also transforming. And it's transforming because there are things that happen during the Middle Passage that have not happened anywhere else ever in the world ever. One of those things is the melding of ethnic groups into one collective identity. Before they were the Ewe, the Tiv, the Ga, the Serere, the Mandinka, the Hausa, etc. Once they get on these boats, however, those ethnic identities begin to meld away and they become something else altogether. Because now their language becomes one language, right? Their trauma becomes one collective trauma, right? They experience the ocean and they experience the water in a different way than they did back home, etc. And I argue that the African American is birthed in the Atlantic Ocean, not in America, right? That's the land. We were birthed before we arrived to this place. It's really almost a metaphor, this big ocean, this womb, if you will. And so I wanted to write about this, and I really wanted to write about it as a gift to future generations so that Black children would never, ever, 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 ever forget the unspeakable, the unbelievable, the immeasurable trauma endured that they might arrive alive in this country. Right? That is so profound to me. And this really is before we even get to plantations, of course, and all of that. And the numbers of people who did not survive, the sheer millions, literally the millions of Africans who never saw land again. And I think for us to ever forget that would be criminal, absolutely criminal. So I decided to write about it in a book called The Coming. Yeah.
I was expecting to have the book right there in hand. That threw me off for a little bit. We're always good for self-promotion. That's a favorite here. You've got it. You've done it. It's amazing work. Show it off.
That's yeah, absolutely.
So this transforming and melding to a collective identity, I can remember a scholar I used to work with here, one of my former teachers, who actually used to describe elements of the slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade as one of the largest and first eugenics programs.
Yes, yes.
Would you like to speak on that?
Well, the truth of the matter is, I think that there's more research, of course, that still needs to be done. In fact, ironically, the Middle Passage is the way that 99% of diasporic Africans arrived in the diaspora. And yet it is probably one of the most unresearched historical periods. Some of it is because the trauma is more than most people want to endure, right? But it is so critically important. It's so critically necessary for us to know and to understand that historical moment. But yes, this is a study in eugenics, absolutely, because this is a time period when ethnic groups and blood begins to mingle, right, far differently than it had done so on the continent, right? And also there seems to be a kind of what's the word I want? I don't really want to use this reference, but I will. A kind of survival of the fittest in some ways on these ships. Because again, so many people die. So what's true is really only certain phenotypes, certain African phenotypical characteristics, only certain blood really arrives in the diaspora. Though most African possibilities leave Africa, it is not true that all of those traits make it to the New World, right? And so anyone doing eugenics would absolutely be in heaven to study this period.
I can remember certain scholars who would actually attribute the high number of people who suffer from sickle cell anemia
That's right.
here within the United States to being related to that. As
That's
sickle cell anemia gives you essentially enhanced resistance to malaria and certain other diseases.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
So you were talking about the difficulties in research. How did you research this book, and what did you run across that became difficult for you?
Oh my God, the research was hell, to be perfectly honest about it, right? It was extraordinarily difficult. I researched probably 10 or 15 years. Every slave ship, who made the ships, who modeled these ships, who studied this maritime history. Wow. Who were these white crewmen who ran these slave ships? How much did they get paid? What were the countries that participated in the slave trade? Why did they want Africans? What was peculiar about Africans such that Europeans desired them so desperately? Some of it was labor, yes, but it wasn't all labor. Some of it was also pleasure, right? And this is one of the things that I think people have absolutely wanted to ignore and stepped right over. That a lot of the slave trade was about desirability. It wasn't just about labor and economics, about the dream of the pleasure these black bodies could bring European owners, right? And black bodies, women and men. The rape of men is one of the things that has never been researched, that needs to be researched desperately, but people absolutely won't touch the topic for all kind of reasons we could probably guess. But I'm saying all of this simply to say that as I was researching for this topic, I ran across all of this. I ran across people who captured 18, 22-year-old African boys because they were so unbelievably stout, they would say, or statuesque, are beautifully upright. There were all these terms used to talk about these African bodies. The rape of men, the rape of women, people take easily, right? But the rape of men, people wrestle with, like, oh my God, did that really happen? Oh my God, wow. And there's a book by a white guy, ironically, right, that came out not too long ago called Finding Rufus. I think that's the title. Um, that specifically about, in fact, it's the first book about the rape of Black men during the antebellum period. And so it was very difficult in terms of researching this book. And the other thing I should say is it was emotionally taxing because it's just one horror after the other horror after the other horror after the other trauma. It was just, after a while, it was just more than any soul ought to bear. But I think it's not only worth it, but I think it's absolutely priceless for a future generation.
And yet, excuse me, I'm just putting the title of that book as well as the author in
I
there
think
for you.
it's called Finding Rufus, and his name is Thomas something. I can't remember.
Foster, Thomas A. Foster.
Thomas Foster. That's right. That's right. And is it Finding Rufus? Is that the title?
Rethinking Rufus, Sexual Violations. Let me make sure I have that right. So, in case any of our scholars are looking for it.
Yeah, Rethinking Rufus. Yes.
Now, you mentioned trauma, and that's something I definitely want to talk about again later. And essentially, and a lot of the elements that you're just speaking on about sexuality and the abuse of Black men and masculinity. I mean, that's one of the things which are central to your next novel, but we still got some other ones to go first. There's a couple more things I want to get out about the coming. First and foremost, I mean, you seem to feel and you present as though you present that you're channeling these spirits and that you're being the keeper of these tales. Given your fascination with history and storytelling, these spiritual stories, in fact, do you see yourself as a modern day griot?
I don't know that I do. I think of a griot in a far more complicated way, right? I think of a griot as kind of the mouthpiece of the king, as the main courtier, as a bard. And I don't know that I do all of that. I see myself definitely as a storyteller for sure. But I think storytelling is just one thing that that griots do, and so I certainly wouldn't fight the comparison. In fact, I'd be humbled and honored for sure. But officially, I think I'm much more of a storyteller in the strictest sense.
Hmm. Very good, very good. One of the most unique elements of the book is the stripping of collective consciousness till we essentially have a singular individual.
Yes.
Was this a commentary on the loss of identity suffered by the enslaved?
No. Here's what I wanted to do with The Coming. What I wanted to do with The Coming was to tell the story of our ancestors, these Africans who were brought on the slave ship. But I wanted to do so in one of their own literary traditions. See, captured Africans would know American literary or European literary traditions. Yeah, right. They had never been there. They had not spoken that language. That wasn't their culture. So they would not have spoken in novelistic terms or in prose, etc. Right. They would have spoken much more in what we think of now, sort of as a kind of the epic narrative, the epic poem. That's probably the closest, a genre that Africans might have known in terms of how they did narrative and how they did storytelling. So I wanted to put it in that mode, right? And I also wanted to move away from the European notion of structure and narrative such that you have one protagonist in a story, right? That's a particular Western model also. And Africans didn't do storytelling in that way, right? They conceived of things far more as things that happened to a people much more than a person, right? And one thing that I read years ago that kind of tripped me onto this was a proverb that says, "It cannot rain on one person alone." Right, and I love that proverb. That it never rains on one person. So usually events don't happen to individuals; they happen to collective. They happen to groups of people or communities of people. And so telling this narrative as with the third person, as the leading strategy, if you will, was it was difficult, but I think it works really, really well because then you learn about what happens to us, and 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 this is a shared trauma. This is not an individual act or an individual bearing the weight. It's a shared trauma, and everybody gets praise. Everybody carries also certain responsibility for what happened to us. So I think that strategic form works.
Hmm. Authors tend to fixate when writing. They hit a groove and they could end up writing an entirely separate book on one particular element. I've known other authors who literally actually will take one part and then write an entirely different series of novels about that. What part of The Coming caught your spirit the most?
I think the section where after many, many days, these Africans begin to shout their names out loud to captors, to the crewmen upstairs. I think that really stuck out in my head. How they were declaring their humanity, how they were shouting and announcing their personhood, how they were determined to keep their life force vital. That these folks, though physically in bondage, were absolutely making it clear that their spirits were untouched. Their souls were still intact. And I think to create this ritual, if you will, on these slave ships that announced the continuation of their being, I think is profound.
You're talking about that transference and that connection from the people who came across from the transatlantic slave trade. What elements of their culture, what elements of their spirit do you think are most vital for us today?
You know, I think that one of the things our ancestors came with that I think was multiplied on the slave ship is their relationship, literally and metaphorically, to water. I think there's something sacred. I think there's something sacrosanct. I think there's something spiritual about Black people and water. We sing about it. We talk about it. You know, our early spirituals talked about Wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. The old ship of Zion, right? Um, um, uh, our our early spirituals talked about troubled seas. You know, um, about all these ways in which Black people were in tension with water, and the ways in which water ushered us and assured that we would survive in this place called America. So I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by our metaphorical and literal relationship to water, and the ways in which Black people transferred and transformed that into melody and to song once they arrived.
Okay, well, we've gotten from the introduction of Black people to the Americas, and let's go all the way to our author here today and his excuse me, dyslexia is kicking in, semi-autobiographical work, Don't Cry for Me.
Yes, sir.
Recent release this year. And this is the story, an epistolary, basically, where you talk about the relationship between you and your father, and more importantly, the conceptualization of your father as he's speaking to you.
Right,
I
right.
would ask what inspired you, but you kind of covered that very well in your introduction.
Yes,
Now,
sir. Yes, sir.
as it was semi-autobiographical, and while reading it, you let your heart out on those pages. I mean, there are a lot of things which seem very painful in this book. And more importantly, not only are they painful, but they're honest and true. How much of this book was fact and how much was fiction?
The truth is, I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. You know, I've been asked that a million times, and I would probably say 30% might be fact and the other 70 fiction, probably, is my guess.
Okay. Were there any events in you or your father's life that you felt were too painful to include?
No, no, because most of what um, I included, of course, some very, very, very beautiful things, but also some very difficult things. And I can't think of anything that I was intentional about omitting or avoiding. I'm trying to run it through in my head now, um, and no, so no.
All right.
Again, like I said earlier, I'm, I'm I discovered that as a writer, the minute you get afraid of things, you have to stop writing,
Mm.
because now you're going to monitor what can be said and what cannot be said, and that's dishonest to the narrative. And so for me, in order to write, there can be no holds barred.
It's funny that you mentioned that being dishonest to the narrative. As a writer of fiction, I mean, the narrative itself, while it is an extension of yourself, it is still a fictional narrative. So isn't dishonesty already established as part of that?
No, because fiction doesn't mean false. Fiction does not mean a thing is untrue. It means it's not factual. But see, fact is not facts and truth, right? Do not equate either, right? If should I elaborate?
Please do.
Okay. See, a person can have a set of facts and you still don't have the truth. The murder of Emmett Till, it happened in 1955, right? Fact. It happened at the Tallahatchie River. Fact. He was 14 years old. Fact. All those are facts. But that does not tell you the truth of what happened. The truth of what happened is that white folks in Money, Mississippi absolutely positively demonstrated that they own black bodies, and that black bodies would be dismantled if they would not agree to uphold white supremacy. That's truth.
Mm. And we still feel the pains of that today.
Absolutely.
I can personally attest to people who are related to Emmett Till. And
Right.
even still, the discussion is still something which still harkens in those fears generations later.
Oh, absolutely. For sure. For sure.
And you yourself, your family originates from Mississippi, right?
No. Arkansas.
Arkansas. Okay, I thought in part of the book you mentioned somebody from Coldwater, Mississippi. I was like, I know that.
Yes. Now, my great grandfather came from Coldwater, Mississippi. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I know where it's at, on the just south of Memphis.
That's right, just south of Memphis. That's exactly right.
Yeah, my family come from Mississippi, and we come from the country parts.
Yeah.
Places like Sugar Lot, and there's actually a hot water Mississippi up the road.
Absolutely.
That's one thing you gotta love about Mississippi, is that it is country.
Yes.
But that country, because it is so far, it hides a lot of sins and a lot of pain. And I think you uncovering some of these painful stories, you know, it helps add to our understanding of elements like that. Like you're talking about your grandfather, your you're talking about your great grandfather, you're talking about your father and those experiences. So my next question is, love, family, and the oppression of community/culture are front and center in this book. While oftentimes these are things which have been saving graces of the Black community and Black people, as evidence in this book, there are also things that can hurt and hold us back. Right. How do you reconcile self-liberation with the tradition, cultural values, and the idea of community?
Yes, great question. And see, for me, liberation has to include community. If not, we're trading oppressions. Woo, God. In other words, see, for me, part of the problem with American notions of liberation is what they mean is a person's acquisition of excess. But see, that for me is not liberty. That simply is one acquiring riches. But a person can be rich and not be liberated at all, for me. Right? It's like Harriet Tubman never had money, but she's probably the freest person I know of. Mm. Right? And I think that's extremely, extremely, extremely important. And I think when our ancestors were running to freedom and they were trying to give us freedom as a people, they were not inviting us as Black people to become financially wealthy. They were inviting us to know that wealth does not include money, that wealth does not include and should not include somebody else's oppression. But that's the problem in America. But see, some people want to get rid of patriarchy, but they want to hold on to misogyny, right? Some folks want to get rid of homophobia, right? But they want to hold on to transphobia. So, see, we have to be against oppression, not the particular one, and not only the particular one that affects a person most. And I think that's extremely, 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 extremely important. So for me, liberty is to be found when one is clear, right, that one's freedom equals the freedom um, of everybody else in the community.
Not a one is free until we're all free.
Absolutely.
Now, masculinity in the Black community and toxicity that that brings is central to this novel. How do you define masculinity?
It's a tricky game because I'm not sure I even define masculinity, but I do believe that there is something divine about being a man. I absolutely believe that. I am a man and I believe that. I think there's something divine about being a woman too. What I want us to be able to do, right, is to be able to see those divinities without believing one needs to be the slave of the other, right? And so for me, masculinity then is a the demonstration of a man's confidence in who he is. See, what most people miss is the confidence part. What really makes a person attractive, what really makes a person attractive, give that to Lisa. What really makes a person attractive is um, is if they have the confidence to be themselves. You see what I'm saying? Right, the confidence to be themselves. Not other people's sanction, not other people's okay with it, not other people's belief that it's all right. No. Do you have the confidence to walk as yourself? Because if you have the confidence to walk as yourself, the rest of the world has no choice but to applaud. So a man who's confident about the beauty of who he is, that's what I think is the most astounding masculinity.
I can agree with you. That confidence, that belief in oneself, and that understanding of oneself, the ability to exert yourself as an individual and express agency are fundamental.
Absolutely.
I'd also add probably the sense of responsibility.
Absolutely.
I mean, in manhood, one of the things which I kind of felt about your father and your grandfather, as you're kind of explaining, is as you're talking about them in the book, is that the notion that their lives don't simply belong to them, but also belong to the people that they care about. So they dedicate their lives to these people.
Right.
So I mean, that notion of service is a big thing I've always felt was a part of it.
Absolutely.
I was surprised when Isaac's mother cascaded for coming out and blaming Jacob. Giving all the time she stood up for Jacob and Isaac.
Yes.
Was her fixation on Isaac being free really entirely about Isaac, or was she projecting, or at least partially projecting, her own desire for freedom and sense of disappointment on Isaac?
I think she was. I think she absolutely was. And the truth of the matter is, I think in many ways, Isaac was living the life she had always longed for. Right? She wanted to be a writer. She wanted to be a poet. She wanted, etc. And that didn't pan out for her. But I think in many, many ways, she was hoping that Isaac would do exactly what she had once dreamed. And in her head, Isaac being gay would mean that Isaac could not do that, because part of that dream was, certain traditions in terms of marriage and kids and all of that. And she wanted that for him. What's funny is, of course, Jacob wanted that, but we see she wanted some of that also for him. But listen, it's the 1970s. All parents wanted that for kids in the 1970s. You know what I mean? In the 1970s, almost nobody was as quote unquote liberated as people are now. I can't think of any kids from that era who said my parents were fine with me being LGBTQ. That they were perfectly fine. I never heard that. It happens now.
I don't think that was said all that often back then.
Yeah.
Just to comment on that, I mean, there's an old saying that they used to say where I came from. Fathers beat you for every sin that they ever committed, and those they fear will be committed against you. And so that kind of speaks to that concept of why certain things, like you address in the book, like homosexuality,
right,
and these certain social constructs, which society is seen as wrong for no particular reason, but they teach against them because they want to protect you from the society and the horrors of those societies.
Right, absolutely.
If your father was still with us in the flesh, I know we're still here with us in the spirit, what would you like to tell him?
Oh, I think that's a wonderful question. And what would I say? I think very simply, I would simply say that what you gave was enough. It was enough. It was enough. There are times when I thought it wasn't, but it absolutely was, because when I look at myself now and I look at where I am now, it had to have been. It had to have been. And I think the best you can ever ask from a generation is, give me what you got. I think, as you mentioned earlier, I think one's own agency will surprise a person one day when you realize how much you can do with so little. Our problem has been thinking that we didn't get enough. But the truth of the matter is, when you really understand the depth of your own agency, you can take very little and take it a long way.
And honestly, having read the book, that's really what I was kind of hoping to hear. That's the one thing I really want to add. It was that I just felt for the dad and this wanting to express his love and never really knowing, how his son really feels about him. It
That's
felt
right.
as though Jacob really did love his father, but just didn't know how to connect because his father had always been so rough
Yes.
and distant.
Yeah.
But I mean, his father, and that's one of the things, is that they're loving. They're trying to show it just in the only ways that they know.
Right. Right.
Now, we talked about how we got here. We talked about liberation of the spirits and what the modern Black family looks like. Now on to Juneteenth, which is our central theme for this week and next week's activities. As you know, this is such a part of our inaugural Juneteenth celebration. That said, the books we discussed today give a story about being bound and then finding liberation. To my mind, kind of encompasses what Juneteenth is all about. What does Juneteenth and liberation mean to you?
I think the beauty of Juneteenth is that it celebrates. Let me say it this way. I think the beauty of Juneteenth is that it celebrates the fact that something came far, far, far too late. See, it's not just that folks in Texas found out 2 years later. That is true. That's true, right? In June of 1865. That's true. That's not the issue. The freedom from slavery is what came too late. It was 400 years too late, right? Not just a few months. It was 400 years too late, right? The other thing that I think is really critical that most people sleep on is it was not true that Black people just started partying as soon as they heard in Texas. That's not true. The real history is that Black people started looking and putting families back together. That's what happened. People literally walked off plantations the day they heard, looking for children they hadn't seen in 20 years, looking for parents who had been sold away 12 years earlier. That's the true story. That's the real story. And what most people don't know, Professor Cotton, is Black people have family reunions because of this. Because we have been trying to put families back together since slavery ended.
That's very interesting. That's the first time I'm actually seeing that connection between family unions and the end of slavery.
Absolutely.
One of the interesting things I just want to bring up is we actually had a speaker before, Mr. Eli Grayson, who talked about the freemen of the later freemen, but the enslaved peoples who are actually still owned by the Five Nations or the Native Americans. Mm-hmm. And contrary to popular belief, while Juneteenth is the end of slavery in Texas, the last of those slaves to find out from the Confederacy, slaves in the North didn't actually get their freedom until December. And those in the five tribes wouldn't actually get their freedom for another 2 years.
Yes,
1 to 2 years.
That's right. It is not true that Juneteenth ends and frees all slaves in the United States of America. That is not true. There are some, history is still kind of bearing it out, but there are some stories, some narratives of people who didn't hear about freedom until almost the 20th century. Like the 1880s, some folks even say, as late as. I don't have sources for that. Those are just assertions I've read about, but I'm certainly going to check that out, and I wouldn't find that difficult to believe at all.
Oh, I agree. Technically, we still have slavery today, but that'll be a discussion for a whole nother day.
Right.
So I've got one more question for you. Then we're going to open up to the community. We're going to open up to our viewers.
Okay.
Oof. Okay, I had two good ones, but I got to choose one.
Okay.
All right. Given the subject of sexism, homophobia, and erasure of Black people who rejected societal norms, how does Black joy today look like compared to that of the past?
Oh, what does Black joy look like today compared to that? You know, I think for me, Black joy is in the eyes of Black children, right? It's the ability to look at a Black child and see the Black child as wonderful and divine and beautiful and amazing, even while they're messed up. See, the job of parents, the job of elders, the job of all of us, right, as adults, is something wrong with the community if the adult child is struggling. If the only children we can see as wonderful are the children who are doing wonderfully, we are a blind people. We've got to be able to see that child in detention as W.E.B. Du Bois. We've got to be able to see that. Because, see, if we do, we will understand that this child in detention, it's not because something's wrong with you. It's not because you're messed up. No, it's not because you're ADHD. It's none of that. It's because somebody did not affirm your genius. So let me do it. See, it's the assumptions we make about our children. It's the assumptions we make about our children that direct and guide their existence. And just because you know, a child might bring home a C, right, on a report card, that has nothing to do with that child's intelligence in most instances. Absolutely, positively nothing. But depending on how we react to it, we will teach the child what we think of them. And if you ask most children what their elders think of them right now, most of them will tell you either they don't know or it's something unbeautiful. Because we're not good about intentionally stopping a child and looking into their eyes and telling them, do you know you're the most magical thing on this planet? Because most of us didn't hear it either. I just think that's so critically important. You know, Black joy is created. It doesn't fall out of the sky.
Very powerful again. Well, we've got a couple more minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to the audience to see if we have any questions. Just go ahead and raise your hand if you've got one, and I'll give you.
I do have, Josh. This is Dr. Black. I'm sitting here and just at odds with your discussion here.
Thank you.
This is very deep. This is a very deep conversation, and thank you for having the confidence and the freedom, the level of freedom. It takes a level of freedom to talk about what you just discussed. And I've stolen one of your words. I didn't know how to put it as a sociologist, but I know self-imposed incarceration.
That's right.
So many of us think we're free because we're walking around, we're talking, but we don't realize that we are still in shackles.
Absolutely.
That we are still in shackles. And I mean, and I'm like, okay, this is the word I've been looking for, but I do want to have a question. And I almost said that, did we grow up in the same community in Mississippi? Because what you talked about, my parents did the same type of rear. So when you talk about wisdom from the elders now, you know, folks don't call themselves elders
right
anymore unless you in a certain I lost my train of thought, but I want to talk about now we see this level of consciousness in community I don't want to say the word lost, but it has been thrown overboard. That if you teach your children some of the ways that we grew up, it is seen as old fogey, conservative, and that folks don't do that anymore.
Right.
Okay. And that level of consciousness that we have, it was good enough for us, but now it seems that it's not good enough for our kids or our grandkids. How can we start to rethink this level of consciousness in our community? Because it was good. I mean, we prayed.
Sure.
Like you said, we ate together. We did things together as a community, and it worked. So how can we, if we can. I don't want to use the word if, but I want to think that we could get back and restore some of the this level of consciousness.
Sure.
That might, yeah.
I got you. And
okay.
Thank you so much for the question. I appreciate it. And thank you for the affirmation to me. That means so much. Thank you very much. I'd say three things quickly. One, stop asking children's permission to do things that's going to grow them. There's no need to have a discussion with children about that. That's an error. Like, there was a day when Black parents took children to Sunday school because we go to church. Not because the children wanted it, not because the children believe in God, not because the children agreed. But see, the day would come, they knew, when what the child learned would keep you afloat. You know, it means something when you get in trouble and you have a scripture you can call upon in your head. It means something when you can recall a song and sing it to yourself when you're having a difficult day. See, that means something. Right now, we've left our children almost with no cultural artifact for them to hold on to in the midst of their difficulty. So they start smoking weed when they're 13. You know, I get that. You have to have something to pull from and to pull on, right, as a people. So that's number one. The second thing that I think is important is I think we need to rethink what we name our children. I think we need to stop giving our children European names. But okay, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to just drop that and just leave it, right? Because, and I'm going to say this, right, that most people never think of. Isn't it interesting that white folks don't name their children African names? Even the ones who live in Africa. But okay, I'll leave that alone. Number three that I will say that I think is very important, right? And that is, we've got to put children in front of elders. We got to connect children and old people again. See, there's something magical about an 8-year-old knowing an 82-year-old. There's something magical about a 5-year-old, right, who spends time with a 90-year-old. Most people now, you know, if they're 5, their grandmother's 40, right? And so connecting those generations is magic and is magical. And people exchange ideas. And what people sleep on is it keeps old people alive too. Because they're borrowing life force from young folks. But okay, I don't want to, right. But that's enough. That's enough.
All right, do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yes, I have one. This is Jennifer Wallace. My question is, do you think that the instability of residents within communities makes a difference? And what I mean by that, when I grew up in the Mississippi Delta, there were people who were on each block that were watchdogs. And if you did something that was not reputable of the family, those people chastised you and they reported to your parents. And I don't know which one was the worst, reporting to your parents or them chastising you. So do you think that the fact that people move around, students are not stable in schools, we don't have teachers from the community in the schools, do you think that all of that play a part in the challenges that we are facing?
I think so. I think instability means everything. I think it means absolutely everything in terms of a child's inability to get rooted. See, being rooted means a person can grow. If every time we turn around, we're being put out, if every time we turn around, we having to move, right, a child's rootedness will be very shallow and their ability to grow strong internally will be difficult. There's something about making a child stay somewhere, but then the parents have to have the maturity to stay too. Right. And the other thing is people have to understand that if you're going to rear children, that's a different commitment than the notion of what it means to grow your career. If you're going to grow your career, do so. But when the children come along, you have to be able to say, well, you know what, career, you're going to have to wait because the children have to be first and foremost. Am I saying, oh my God, you have to put your career on the back burner? I might be saying it. And what I also might be saying is that I think we as Black folks have gone too far in terms of trying to provide materiality or material substance to Black children as the sign of success. We could do with less material thing and far more spiritual substance. Most of our kids have more shoes than they need. They have more clothes than they can wear. They have more sneakers than there are days of the week. But what they do not have is more character than they need. And so I would urge us to pull back from materiality and to err on the side of emotional and spiritual substance and time. You know, when I think of growing up as a child, I don't remember the shoes I had. I don't remember that. Like, that doesn't prefigure important. What's really important to me is my grandmother and I shelling peas together. I remember that well. I remember those.
Yes. Oh gosh. Yes. Yes. Yes.
You know, and so the things that are important are not the things we're killing ourselves over. So I would tell us to relook at our value system.
All right, we're a little bit over, but I think we got time for maybe one more question.
Yes.
Oh, Dr. McNeil is really in this conversation. I see.
Oh yeah. We got to bring him back. You got to come back. Now, keep his number. We need more when school's back in the fall. Please bring Dr. Black back. This is great.
Oh,
this
wow.
is great.
I'm so honored. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions from the audience? All right. Well, this has been a production of the Institute for Social Justice and Race Relations at Jackson State University. We want to thank our guest, Dr. Daniel Black, for coming out today. I'm going to let Dr. McNeil go ahead and recognize some of our guests in the who are here today.
Well, Dr. Mosley, I see that you're still on, our provost. You want to say something?
Okay. Well, good afternoon. It's been just wondrous and so enlightening. I've truly enjoyed the conversation and the discourse, and this is just in line with the celebration of a very critical time in our history that is often forgotten.
Yes.
So thank you, Dr. Black, for being here, and thank you to everyone who's here to really tell the story of how we've overcome.
Yes.
And I really appreciate it and look forward to the next event.
Thank you, Provost Mosley. And we also have some of our other staff folks that work with us in the Institute on. We have, of course, Josh. We have Dr. Ramon Jackson is our summer fellow. We have Dr. Phyllis Lewis Hale, excuse me. We have Mr. Keith McMillan. We have Miss Kenya Hudson. And we thank you. We certainly thank you. We thank our audience for coming. Today, we have a few more activities coming next week. We have one on tomorrow, so please feel free to come and enjoy this celebration. And again, Dr. Black, I personally, as an activity director, thank you. This was sociology 101 all day, what I've taught for almost 30 years myself. So again, look for a call.
Yes, ma'am. I would love to come back. Absolutely.
Look for a call, and we will most certainly have you back. And Josh, thank you for recommending Dr. Black to us. And back to you, Josh. You can close it out, and thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. McNeil. And again, thank you, Dr. Black, as well as our audience. Just want to remind you guys that we have a couple more programs coming up. Tomorrow we have the Jazz on the Patio, which will be over in the new Student Center. Monday, we have the food equity conversation that will have Dr. Cindy Elliott Ayers, as well as representatives from Cooperative Jackson. Tuesday, we are broadcasting as well as showing Talamika Bryce's 5, A Mother's Journey, which is a award-winning international hit documentary film. Wednesday, we will be having the luncheon with our civil rights veterans. And Thursday, we have, Painting with Justin Ransburg, or Ransburg Live. That's going to be by appointment only, and that one is generally geared towards our students and our camp students. And then join us again on next Friday for our big Juneteenth celebration. We got one at noon, and we're also working with Student Life on their large one coming up that evening. I've been Joshua Cotton, and this has been a production for the Institute for Social Justice and Race Relations. Thank you, and good day.
Bye, y'all.
All right. Since we killed the second recording, we are good. Dr. Black, thank you so much for coming out. Oh, you already logged off. Okay.